I am Mark Rollins, Dean of University College, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to the first of 4 talks under the auspices of the Master of Liberal Arts program, that is the MLA program, which is run by University College. Each talk this year will be on some aspect of memory. Our aim in this MLA speaker series is to provide our audience with opportunities to hear about and to discuss topics of general interest from a variety of critical disciplinary perspectives. That approach is the hallmark of the MLA program, and I hope that through these lectures, some of you will become interested in it. And if so, you will find literature in the lobby outside and also on our website. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are meeting today on lands formerly that belonged to the Osage Nation that were lost as a result of the Louisiana Purchase to the United States. I say this not as a political statement, but simply to note that the roots of cultural memory often run deep and unseen. The first talk in the series this year will be given by my friend and colleague, Carl Craver, professor of philosophy and in the Philosophy-Neuroscience-Psychology program. Professor Craver received his PhD in the history and philosophy of science at the University of Pittsburgh in 1998, having also completed there in 1996, something unusual for a philosopher, I will say, a Master of Science degree in neuroscience. Carl joined our faculty in 2001. He is, I hope I can say this without embarrassing him, a leading and perhaps the leading expert on what it means to speak of mechanisms in the brain, memory mechanisms among them. He's the author of 2 books on the subject, the award-winning 2013 book, In Search of Mechanisms, Discoveries Across the Life Sciences, and the 2017 book, Explaining the Brain, Mechanisms in the Mosaic Unity of Neuroscience, published by Oxford University Press. He has, by my count, also authored about 70 articles, chapters, and reviews. He's received a dozen grants, including one from the National Science Foundation, and he is in great demand as a speaker for reasons that you will soon understand, having given, amazingly, I think I'm right, about 225 talks at talks all around the globe. I'm told, though, by the staff that he's very good about turning in his travel receipts. In addition, he always finds time to sit down and talk with me about the mind, about memory, and the arts, helping me remember things in our philosophical lives together that I would probably otherwise forget. We're very fortunate to have Carl Craver with us today to speak on the topic of living without memory. Please welcome Carl Craver.
Oh, it's not coming? Now we've got it. All right, great. Thanks, Mark, for the really nice introduction. Mark was involved in hiring me here at Washington University. So he's under some obligation to say some nice things at this point. But it occurred to me while I was walking over here today through the Des Moines neighborhood that after nearly 20 years here at Washington University, I've become as much a product of this place as I was of the University of Pittsburgh before it. And the research project that I want to talk to you about today exhibits that in spades. It's in part through coming to the Philosophy-Neuroscience-Psychology program here at Washington University that I met numerous scholars around the university, Jim Wirch among them, who work on memory. And it was through this program that I encountered a man named Endel Tulving, who is perhaps the most famous memory researcher alive today. And he he saw me give a talk at a Center for Humanities session here where I thought I was just making things up, talking about amnesia and its impact on the life of persons. And it turned out that Endel Tulving was sitting in the back of the room. I would have been terrified had I known that. And after the talk, he came up to me, introduced himself, and said, these are really interesting questions that psychologists don't often think about, and you really ought to come north to Toronto to meet some of the subjects that we've been talking about and to start doing your own experiments. And when Endel Tulving invites you to come do experiments, you say thank you very much and buy a plane ticket, which is exactly what I did. And that was really 10 to 15 years ago. And now I continue to work on these topics, and I think a book is starting to be ready. And the working title of the book is Living Without Memory. And I want to explore this widespread cultural idea that memory, and in particular memory of the things that we've done, plays a crucial role in our lives as persons that can't be played by other forms of memory, like our memories of facts or our habits. And that idea is incredibly widespread, and it informs not only our philosophical thinking about these things, but also our scientific thinking about these things. And I think that many of those ideas are in fact false. And hopefully by the end of today, I will convince you that that's the case, and that will prompt us to look for new answers to the question, why do we think memory is so important to our lives as persons? I'll tell you about all of these individuals a bit. But my overarching philosophical view, and what gets me out of bed in the morning and keeps me up late at night, is trying to bring two images of the human organism into some sort of stereoscopic perspective with one another. On the one hand, we treat one another as loved ones and friends and family members with whom we can have conversations, from whom we can learn, with whom we can have arguments, and they are things that are important to us and held responsible for their actions and deeply valuable to us as that kind of thing. And on the other hand, we view one another, if we go into the laboratory and start doing psychological research, we view one another as co-localized machines that do various things that we can tease apart through careful experimental study. And for me, the pressing philosophical problem is how to reconcile those two images of the human animal. One that sees us as a collection of machines that process information by trafficking in electrical potentials, and on the other hand, the view of human beings that sees them as reasonable deliberators that act for good reasons and have desires and motivations and thoughts about things. And seeing those two things at once in the organism is, to me, a major trick. And exactly how we're going to pull off that trick is what's driving me to do the work here. This is just to say that, we think of it, we have this high and lofty view of the human animal as rational creatures on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have this view that you're just a bunch of parts that interact with one another with neurotransmitters and electrical signals. And the question is, how do we get both of those images of ourselves into the same screen? And the way that I want to get at this is through this topic of memory. I put this picture up because I think my earliest memory, though it's hard to know which one is exactly the earliest, involves walking through my grandfather's backyard on a morning with the dew spread over the yard. He didn't have a lot of money, and he managed to get the grass seed to plant his yard somehow, I think, by stealing it from a local golf course. And when he did this, he stole the grass seed that they used for the greens. And so his backyard was the most delicate, velvety grass. And he had this incredible mowing equipment that he used to keep it all looking very nice. And I just remember how great it felt on my feet. And I can transport myself, as it were, effortlessly back to a time in that backyard. I can feel the dew on my feet. I can smell the clover in the grass. And I'm there. And that was when I was 3 years old. And I have the sense, and we all have that sense, and I think we confront it when we think about things like dementia, aging, senility. We have the sense that those memories are the thing that make us who we are. And that as those memories start to fade, we're losing touch not only with our past, but with ourselves in some fundamental way. And that that's our undoing. And it was exactly that thought that led me to start being interested in these individuals that we'll be talking about in just a second. Now, it turns out that there are tons of studies that suggest that, as a matter of fact, not only is this capacity to vividly reconstruct images of past experiences about the past, it's also about projecting ourselves into the future. So individuals who have deficits in this kind of cognition also have difficulty saying what they plan to do tomorrow. It's a famous conversation between Endel Talving and a person that you'll be hearing quite a bit about, Kent Cochran, known by the initials KC until he died a few years ago. Endel says, let's try the question again about the future. What will you be doing tomorrow? He says, I don't know. Well, do you remember the question? Endel asks him to make sure. Oh, you mean about what I'll be doing tomorrow? Yeah. How would you describe your state of mind when you try to think about it? And he says, blank, I guess. It's like being asleep. It's a big blankness sort of thing, he said once. It's like being in a room and there's nothing there and having a guy tell you to go find a chair and there's nothing there. It's like swimming in the middle of a lake. There's nothing there to hold you up or to do anything with. It's a very poetic description of the state of mind that one's left in when one, as it were, has this cognitive capacity removed, and so you might think is somehow now trapped or bound to the present. That's the idea that many psychologists have taken and started to run with. In fact, one of my real idols, Oliver Sacks, in his first real hit book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, describes the case of Jimmy G, the Lost Mariner. Why he diminutized the name, I'm not exactly sure, but Jimmy G, the Lost Mariner, who because of Korsakov's syndrome, drinking heavily while a member of the Navy, he had damaged the mammillary bodies in his limbic system and had lost the ability to remember anything. And in his characteristic way, Oliver Sacks describes him and asks the question, what would be left of a life, of a person, if everything else remained intact, but the memories for the things that you'd done had dropped out of the equation entirely? And Oliver Sacks' conclusion at the end of this is not much. Jimmy G is able to do the rosary and seems to enjoy doing the rosary, but much of his life is just blank to him, much the way that Kent Cochran had described it. So we start describing them as sort of adrift on an ocean, somehow unaware of who they are or where they're going. And you might have heard about, if you've taken some intro psych courses here, you can't get through an intro psych course without hearing about H.M., who lived in Massachusetts and was a subject of surgery in an effort to remove his life-threatening epilepsy. The drugs were no longer working, and so they performed a bilateral hippocampectomy, removing his hippocampus, a structure in the temporal lobes of the brain, on both sides. He was one of 9 subjects, I believe, in this study. The other 8 had schizophrenia. One of them I'll talk about in just a second. He was the only one with epilepsy who had this surgery, and it did, in fact, help to eliminate his seizures. But when he woke up, he was unable to remember anything that had happened over the course of his life. This is William Scoville at the top performing the surgery on this matter. This is Brenda Milner, who was the first person who started doing the psychological experiments to characterize the memory deficit in HM. He was the first really clean case, in part because it was surgically caused. People could localize the deficit much more cleanly in this case than they could in others. This individual, HM, was then passed to Sue Corkin at some point by Brenda Milner. She inherited HM as a research subject, and hundreds of papers have been written on what's left of HM's life. I'll say more about him in just a second, but it's become common. Sue Corkin, as I'll point out in just a second, has published a book that's called Permanent Present Tense, which is again meant to suggest that having lost one's memory and lost one's ability to imagine the future traps one somehow in the here and now. Clive Wearing reinforces this idea. Perhaps you've seen these videos of Clive Wearing that are readily Googleable. Clive Wearing is a symphony conductor who gets herpes simplex encephalitis, and as a result starts showing profound cognitive deficits. Among them is a memory deficit where he seems to not remember anything from earlier in his life. He keeps a diary. In the diary, it looks like this. I don't know if you can see it all the way in the back, but it says things like, I wake for the first time at 7:46 a.m. 7:47 a.m. This illness has been like death until now. 7:51, first consciousness strong. And it's as if every minute he's then said, and now I'm awake for the first time. It's as if the world has popped into existence in front of his eyes. And it's odd that he keeps writing it down, even knowing it's in front of him. And Kent ends up as a member of this cast in part because he had a motorcycle accident. He also wrecked his Volkswagen. He also got hit in the head with a bale of hay. There are lots of stories in KC's past, and many things that could be responsible for the deficits that we see in him. But one thing that's crystal clear is that he can't remember anything from his life. He can't remember being evacuated from his house when a train wrecked in the backyard, spilling toxic chemicals. He doesn't remember being on the boat when his brother was drowned. Nothing, not even the really significant events from his life are there. He can name everyone in this picture, for example. That's my mom, that's my dad, that's my brother, that's his wife, etc. And this must be a wedding, he correctly infers. But looking at the picture, he says, hey, what's up with my hair? And the answer to that question, it turns out, is that Kent, in order to surprise his brother and sister on the night before the wedding, decided to give himself a permanent. He has no memory of any of that. This is him sitting with his mother, Ruth, looking through family photos, which he enjoyed doing, and could name all of the people in them, and often could recognize events, but doesn't remember having been in them himself, has no personal memories of all of this. And as part of doing all of this is the last individual I'll mention. I came across a case from the 1920s in Germany that still fascinates me to this day. Once I get started talking, I can barely stop. He had carbon monoxide poisoning and was found unconscious on the floor of the Schalkerverein in Gelsenkirchen in the Ruhrgebiet in Germany. And when he woke up, he couldn't remember anything for longer than about 1.6 seconds. And which I think is really fascinating, that there's this person living in the middle of the transition to Nazi Germany and the rise of the Third Reich, and he, rather metaphorically, is standing in the middle of it, registering nothing as it's going on around him. And this guy, Gustav Störing, studies him for many years. It becomes a very controversial case in many ways. But Störing makes a video of Mr. B that we can watch to this day, trying to characterize more than other people what's left of a human life when this capacity has dropped out, and argues that in many ways this person is still alive, still has something capable of being reached, etc. And maybe this is a good moment for me to pause and say what my motivation is here. Partly I am interested in just this old philosophical puzzle. How do I fit the story that cognitive science tells me about human beings together with the way that I feel about my wife and kid? That's for me the big philosophical puzzle. But there is something that's grown to be part of this for me, which is when our relatives begin showing memory deficits, how do we reach them? Do we give up on them and assume that they're no longer persons, that they're trapped in a present, that their identity is disappearing? And in some cases, that is the accurate description of what's going on. But are there ways that we can start working around all of that in order to structure a life for them, or to access what remains in them even when they've lost this thing that we've all come to think is somehow very central to us? So part of what I want to do is to decenter memory in our thinking about this, and to elevate some of the other machines that are in our head, and to celebrate what they can do even when this episodic memory capacity is lost. All right. Just to make sure that we're focused and not floating off into the sky, I want to consider a relatively concrete question that I faced the first time that I went to see Kent. I'm a philosopher, you know. I was not trained as, and when I did neuroscience, it was on things that were in dishes, not human beings. I worked on Alzheimer's disease for a period of time, but all slices of hippocampus, right? The first time that I ever actually met somebody with a memory disorder was when I showed up on the front door of Kent's house. And this isn't Kent, this is about HM, this diagram, but this is the motivation. I had no training on how to do this. I didn't know I was scared to death. I got a haircut. I went out, I bought a new suit so that I would look like the kind of person that should show up at your door to talk to your family members about their memory deficits. And I realized as I was walking through the door that the next thing that we were going to have to do was get consent out of this guy. But the entire reason that I was there to do the studies in the first place was because it wasn't clear that he was the kind of thing that should have the right to give consent for anything at all. And it occurred to me that I didn't know what to do. And this became a real issue in the case of HM. As I said, he got passed from one researcher to the next. And there's a moment in all of this where he's without a guardian. And for several years, HM signed his own consent forms. So several years ago, a couple years, 2016, I guess, Luke Dittrich, who's a reporter for the New York Times, figured out that his grandfather was William Scoville, the guy who did the surgery on HM. And he realized that his grandmother was one of the schizophrenic subjects in the original HM study, and that William Scoville had performed the operation on his own wife. Dittrich was distressed at this discovery, and then writes a book exposing every nastiness in this work that he can find. It's a really amazing book to read, in fact, and I do recommend it to you. But one of the things that he points out in the middle of all of this is he says from 1981 until 1992, 11 years, Henry was the only person giving his informed consent forms when he was visiting the MIT Clinical Research Center, where he would reside as a live-in test subject for as long as a month at a time. Corkin ultimately recognized that Henry's profound amnesia might make it hard to argue that the experiments she and her colleagues were conducting on Henry were properly consented. As she wrote in a statement that she provided to me, his difficulty in retaining new information raised the nagging question of how we obtained consent. Now, if you're thinking, that sounds right, then you've got the bug. You think of memory as playing a really essential role in our being the kind of creature that ought to be allowed to give consent. And what goes for consent, you might think, would go also for signing contracts or making promises to people. The whole sphere of human ethical conduct is distorted, one might think, in some ways by having loss of one of these cognitive capacities like memory. And then my goal, in a way, becomes characterizing the way that that standing in moral space is transformed by this cognitive deficit. And the thought is that if we can look at individuals like Kent and HM and learn from them how having an episodic memory deficit alters your standing in moral space, we can begin to triangulate, to drop tethering lines between those two images of the human organism, connecting what we know about their lives as persons to what we know about them as cognitive machines. How did the scientific community respond to this challenge? Well, the scientists circled their wagons, and 200 of them signed a collective letter in which they pointed out that they are disturbed by these allegations, that the book is biased and misleading, that what he claims about Sue Corkin is contrary to everything that we have known about her as a scientist, colleague, and friend. They point out that she dedicated her life to the study of memory, that she has made major contributions to the study of memory, that she is a highly accomplished scientist, an inspiring teacher, a beloved mentor of students and faculty, a champion of women in science. No mention of the issue of consent. That's the question, one might think. All true. But the question that we want to answer is, can he get consent for himself, and should he have been allowed to consent for himself? Similarly, this is James DiCarlo, the department head of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT, who you might expect had some obligation to respond to this situation. Sue Corkin was dead at this point. He responds to the allegation that the research was destroyed and shredded. She got rid of some of the data in the end, just decided it was not useful anymore and got rid of it. And Luke Dittrich raises questions about that. He also alleges, in ways that I think are not entirely fair to the science, that she suppressed the idea that there was another lesion somewhere in the brain that could be responsible in addition to the damage to the hippocampus. That's not relevant for today. He addresses the question, there was a period of time at the end of all of that where a guy named Thomas Mooney, who was HM's third cousin, was made the guardian and signed all of the consent forms. And he points out that, in fact, it was a family member, a third cousin, and that this was all court approved, so there was nothing funny about that. All correct. But again, this issue of consent is just left missing. And I don't think that this is wrong. I think it's touchy. And I think that none of these guys know what to say about the matter. The scientists are not trained to think about consent. The department's head of brain and cognitive science is not an expert in medical ethics. They need a philosopher, and they don't have one. So I thought, I'll be their philosopher. Okay. And, but in order to be their philosopher, I have to first own up to the truth of the matter, which is that there's a double-edged sword through all of this. For all these years, Endel Tulving and Sue Corkin and all of the people who write on this get their grant money and sell their research on the grounds that memory is central to our identity as persons. You cannot open a paper on memory, a review article on memory, without somebody claiming that this is absolutely central to our status as humans or our status as persons. Again, Sue Corkin's book is entitled Permanent Present Tense. I think she should have known better. And people claim that this is distinctively human. So Endel Tulving famously claimed over here in 1983, we can, if we wish, close our eyes and think about what we did 10 minutes ago or how we celebrated our last birthday, and we can think about what we might be doing tomorrow or next year. This kind of sense of time makes a huge difference to what we are and how we live. If we retained all our other mental capacities, but lost awareness of time in which our lives played out, we might still be uniquely different from all other organisms, but we would no longer be human as we understand it. In a recent review of not that recent anymore, 2002, in a review of animal research attempting to find episodic memory among non-human animals, this researcher Roberts says, do animals have a sense of time, episodic memory, and an ability to cognitively project activities into the future? Or are animals permanently similar to KC and children under the age of 4? Could animals be largely stuck in a permanent present with little ability to remember past episodes or to plan activities for the future? Dalabarba and Lecourt really are the ones that have jumped on this the most. Amnesic patients not only do not consciously remember their past, they cannot imagine their personal future and are severely disoriented in their present world. In light of these observations, amnesia from hippocampal damage cannot be considered pure episodic memory deficits, but rather pathological conditions affecting an individual's entire subjective temporality. Now, from a philosopher's point of view, when you say that somebody doesn't have any sense that they have a future, you're essentially condemning them. They are no longer the sort of thing that can reason about what it's supposed to do next. And if it can't reason about what it's supposed to do because it doesn't have any sense that there's a future, in what sense could it be held responsible for it? And if it can't be held responsible for it, why in the world would you give somebody the responsibility to do it? So this diagnosis, delivered without much evidence, I must say, one conversation with KC, delivers a damning moral psychological diagnosis of individuals without memory. And if you look at the recent literature on this, this is just one, following Susan Fitzpatrick, I've started calling this semantic creep. That you call it episodic memory, and then you say, oh, that's mental time travel. And then that suddenly takes on this huge significance where the way that we escape our being bound to the present, unlike rats, is by projecting ourselves episodically into the future or projecting ourselves into the past. This is the capacity by which we lift ourselves out of the present. And then when you start thinking that way, you can start building experiments around it on addiction and gambling, and you can imagine how all of this goes, right? It's crucial for human decision-making. It's a motivational brake that counters impulsive, short-sighted decisions, that it allows judgment of current situations based on similarity to previously encoded ones. It's precious help for making appropriate decisions under similar circumstances. It supports adaptive behavior and self-control. It's a powerful tool for guiding our actions, for acting prudently in some situations. It's the basis of our decision-making about what we're going to do. And you might think that being able to think about what we're going to do is the basis for our being responsible for what we're going to do. And if we've lost that, we've lost really everything that matters to us about people. So can Kant consent for himself? Could he? Could HM? And I think we have to answer two questions there. What do we need to be able to do to give consent? And can people with episodic memory deficits do those things? So when I showed up at the door, I'm facing this problem, a dilemma, you might think. I don't know when I show up there, whether Kent's able to consent for himself or whether he's not. So I'm ignorant about that. But if I don't give him the right to consent when he deserves it, I'm affecting his autonomy. I'm taking his autonomy. He has the right to make decisions about his own care, and I'm offering somebody else the right to decide on his behalf. But if I afford him the right to consent when he doesn't deserve it, then I put him in a potentially risky situation where somebody who can't think about their own future is licensing me to do what I want to him in the short-term future. And either way, it looks like we risk doing him harm, and we don't have the evidence to tell us which way to go, so we're in a bit of a mess. And the way that, one way that you can handle this situation is the way that we do it with children, and the way that it was often done for HM and for KC at times as well. You have the guardian, some guardian like Mooney, consent for them, and then you don't really involve the subject themselves in the consent process. They just have to assent. They just have to agree to continue going through the experiment. And if at any point they say, I'm done, the experiment ends. But ultimately, you need mom's signature or dad's signature before you can go forward. Now, the advantage of that, of course, is that there's somebody there to catch if things go wrong. But the disadvantage is that I would be very offended if I went to do a psych experiment and they said, Carl, we got to call your mom first. I'd say, no, it's okay. We can proceed without calling mom at this moment. And we don't want to take that away from him. And it also sends a stigmatizing message in a way. You are no longer the kind of thing that can sign this thing. Your mom has to be able to do it. And we don't have any evidence to give that stigma. Right? What we did, which I now think is a cheat, is to ask both Kent and his mom to consent at the same time. We give them both a consent form. We call that dual consent. If Kent can consent under those circumstances, he does when he signs the piece of paper. If he can't consent, he doesn't, but it's okay because mom consented as well. So either way, we protect him from harm by having somebody else looking at the situation. And we also give him the right to speak for himself because he's signing a consent form, not merely assenting to the experiment. That's how we've tried to massage the situation. Of course, if you think it through, it's no different from consent by proxy. If you go through what happens under all of the possible scenarios here, if Ruth and Kent both think it's a great idea, the experiment goes on. If Kent and Ruth both think it's a bad idea, the experiment's over. If Ruth consents and Kent does not, the experiment ends in each case. In one case, it ends because he didn't consent. In the other case, it ends because he didn't assent. The really interesting case is where Kent wants to keep doing the experiments. No, this is fun. I enjoy doing these things. And mom wants to go do something else. What happens there? Well, in that situation, the experiment's over on both of these accounts. And so we are calling it dual consent, but it really amounts to consent by proxy plus deception. So I'm not real crazy about dual consent anymore. I think we ought to, we have to answer the question. Can he give consent or can't he? On the one hand, we can avoid the stigma in this case, but only if he doesn't think about it for too long. So I think that's, the third option is to let him do it for himself. And there we have to balance his autonomy against the potential for harm. Now, in psych, we're not doing anything. We're asking him to generate past tense verbs from present tense verbs, or we're asking him how much he'd pay today for $100 tomorrow. That's not threatening. It's not damaging. We're not pricking him with pins or doing things like that. But nonetheless, we're in a research setting where things could happen that are more serious than what we're describing. All right, so we just have to, we can't avoid the question. We've either got to decide on proxy consent or we've got to let him consent for himself, and that decision has to be made because dual consent is a sham. So why do we think that episodic memory might be required for one to give consent in these cases? Well, some of those passages I read to you earlier suggest that they're thinking that that memory is a kind of like a glue or a string that connects moments of time. And so I give consent, and then at the moment that that consent comes to fruition, when I have to do the experiment, I need something to connect those two moments. What connects those two moments is the thread of memory. In people with amnesia, the thread is cut. So the consent doesn't last any longer. Something like that thought, I think, must be behind people's thinking about this. But there are things that we already know that suggest that that can't be right. I mean, part of the reason why we get consent in writing, for example, is that we know that memory's frail and that we might forget what we consented to, or even that we gave consent. And so we want a written record to hold it down. If somebody forgets, but the written record is still there, the written record is the binding thing. So it doesn't seem to require anything going on inside our heads. And it's also the case that when we coach people on how to get consent from subjects, we don't say, make it really memorable. You know, try wearing a clown hat, for example, or, you know, playing unusual music, or creating strange smells in the environment so that they can transport themselves. What matters is not that they remember vividly the giving of consent. What matters is at the moment that they give consent that they understand what's going on. Right? We also give consent for things when we won't be cognitive at all at the moment that it happens. So for surgery, for example, we're going to be checked out at the time that somebody's doing that hip replacement. But we nonetheless require consent for it, and the consent lasts even though the cognitive light bulb has gone dim. And if I want to have my ashes shot out of a cannon, it would be wrong, I suppose, for somebody to do that without asking for my consent. But having given my consent, it lasts after I've gone. And there's no possibility of my being cognitive anymore. And so this idea that memory has to be a thread that connects these, it seems to me already in our everyday thinking about consent, we already know that this is not the way we should think about it. So why should it matter in these cases? Consent's persistence, it seems, is not like the persistence of a material object. That's the weirdest thing I'm going to say today. Consent to last doesn't require that any material thing get passed. It's an alteration in the moral fabric of things, and it need not have an etching in the material fabric of things for it to work in this way. Compare a friendship or a marriage when you burn the marriage documents or lose the ring. I'm fortunate, having lost 3 wedding rings at this point, that I'm not divorced. All right, so I don't know how much time I've got left. How am I doing, Mark? 15 minutes or so. Let me just dance you through some of the evidence. So that's all just that's background setup. And then there are 10 years worth of experiments we've been doing. Let me just dance through a few of them and try to give you a feel for the sorts of things that we've been asking. And I've organized them around the 3 main things that you want out of consent. Can they be informed? Are they fully capacitated? And are they doing it voluntarily? Those are the questions that I care about. And those nicely frame the question that you might ask. What sort of battery would you throw at someone to see if they're still a person, still a self, still a responsible agent? And there's no answer to that question, so we just started building one. And what you're going to see are bits and pieces of that. Okay. Can he be informed? The times that I've been with him, he was able to not only say what consent was, he volunteered on his own that he had the right to withdraw from the experiment whenever he wanted to. He was usually able, without any prompting, to repeat back what we had told him we were going to do in the experiment and to tell us what the advantages and disadvantages of participating in the experiment were. There's no indication that semantically he didn't get what was going on, that he was part of an experiment, that he doesn't understand what consent is. It's a curious thing about this, that you lose these memories for your experiences, but you don't lose factual knowledge. that remains in place. And that might be enough to anchor one's ability to do things like give consent. This semantic knowledge, they call it, a semantic form of memory that's distinct from episodic memory, can remain intact even when when episodic memory is gone. This will include things like memories of definitions of things, or familiar objects in your environment, or the names of people in those wedding photos, understanding how things work, like mechanical knowledge about devices. Kent was able to talk about how feed screws and extruders were related to one another, even though he didn't remember working in a plant that built scrubbers for factories. And he understands how to do things, procedures. He worked for years delivering books in the library to their Dewey Decimal Place on the shelves, and that was a new skill that he acquired after his deficits. He also knows himself pretty well. So if you ask him questions about the kind of person he is, and then you ask his mom the same questions, they agree nearly 80% of the time, which is probably better than my mother and I would do if in the same situation. We've also seen this in other individuals with amnesia, that they know themselves relatively well, and in fact, their preferences remain very stable over time. It's really hard to get Kent to say what he will do with the money that he gets from doing experiments, because he can't think about the future. He just says, it's blank, I don't know. But I've pushed him several times. No, come on. You're going to get $100. What are you going to do with the $100? And if you push him long enough, he'll say, I'll spend it on beer. And then if you say, well, what kind of beer? It's always Black Label. If he wants to go to a baseball game, it's always the Toronto Blue Jays. Preferences aren't shifting all over the place, as you might imagine. Now, you might say, okay, well, how does this, so he doesn't have problems understanding all of this stuff, and he knows really what he wants and what kind of guy he is. So that's not where the problem lies, if it lies anywhere. Maybe it lies with his lack of knowledge of other people, because maybe I have to simulate or project myself into another person's mind vividly in order to understand what they're thinking. My collaborator, Shana Rosenbaum, did an exhaustive study of mind reading in individuals with episodic amnesia and found them flawless. Kent gets sarcasm. He understands what people are thinking by looking at their facial expressions. He can complete stories with what the person must be thinking in those situations. So although episodic memory has been associated with all different kinds of self-projection into different places and into different minds, it just turns out that you can perfectly well understand other people's mentation without the capacity to episodically remember your past or project yourself into the future. So they understand themselves. They know that there are other people. They know that those other people have minds. That's pretty good. Can they be informed? What if he doesn't know that there's a future? I remember I showed you that conversation with Endel before where he just says the future is blank. That conversation has been repeated in nearly every article on this. It led a philosopher, Christoph Hurl at Warwick, to claim that people without episodic memory don't have a sense of the passage of time. That they don't know that they have a future, they don't know that they have a past, and they don't have a sense that the now is somehow moving from the past into the future. And I thought, well, that's devastating. If you don't understand that tomorrow is going to come, what kind of moral agency are you capable of? But it turns out we asked him, and he did just fine. What's the future? There are events that haven't happened yet. Can you change the future? Yeah. How? By doing different things. Sometimes he looks at me like I'm an idiot. Does what happened in the past influence what happens in the future? He says, yeah. Does something that happens in the future change what happened in the past? He says, no. Does what you do now influence what happens in the future? He says, well, yeah, I guess so. Does what you do now change what's happened in the past? No. We're just trying to get, does he understand that causation works this way in time and not that way in time, and that the window of the now is moving through this space in some sense? If an event is in the future, will it always be in the future? No. Why? Because time moves on, he says. Bingo. I love it when philosophy comes crashing down in a moment of empirical finding. But this was the one that I thought really settled that matter. But you might, I think what I really should do is skip ahead. You might, I'll come back to that in a second. You might wonder, is he knows what time is, and he knows what to say about time, but does he live in time properly? Does he really get it? And we'll get to that. I'll just get to that in a second. All right. You might wonder as well whether he's the same person. So if you think that there's a strong connection between memory and your identity as a person over time, you might think that, that the person who gave consent at time t sub 0 is not the same person that's having the experiment done to them at some later time t sub n greater than 0. And you might think that for reasons that go back to the British empiricists and Locke's view that memory is what makes us who we are, and it is that string that connects our lives together over a period of time. And I'm not going to go into great detail on this. It's not clear how you test whether somebody's the same. We don't have a test for sameness of person over time. Usually memory is the test. But what I will say is that this view is not alive today. And it's not alive because it's circular. To have a veridical memory of your past, you can't remember things that you didn't experience. It's built into the concept of memory that if you truly remember something, that it happened to you. If you remember something and it didn't happen to you, you're not remembering, you're imagining. You're engaged in some other sort of practice. So for memory to be the basis of identity, memory cannot presuppose the very concept of identity within it. But given that memory requires the concept of identity, we're only chasing our tails in this case. Locke got that one wrong, and we need to look somewhere else. But here's what I just want to say at the beginning. We're here interested in the question, can he understand what he's being asked to do? And given his factual knowledge, his self-knowledge, his knowledge of other minds, and his knowledge of time, there doesn't seem to be any reason to deny it to him. And here's the other thing that I'll say about personal identity. If that went by too quickly, and you think, hey, wait a minute, maybe it is the case that he's not the same person between these two times, I would ask you to identify a person in the world who is better able to speak for the later Kent's desires than earlier Kent. Given that his preferences remain the same, given that his knowledge of the world remains the same, given that his sense of who he is remains the same over time, why at this point would you decide that his mom is really the right one to be making the decisions on his behalf? Why not Kent at the earlier time? So let's move on just quickly. I'm going to dance through all of this. You might say all of that's just factual reporting about what he knows, and that can be faked. And that's true. You can say the right things but do all the wrong things. And so we had to do some tests on that. He knows that there's a future, but does he care that there's a future? So Philip Zimbardo, who's responsible for the Stanford prison experiments you might be aware of, devised a personality test that's designed to see whether we tend to be future-oriented, past-oriented, whether we tend to be positive about our pasts or negative about our pasts, whether we are present-oriented and so likely to be hedonistic in some ways, or alternatively depressively fatalistic about the present. And he thinks that these temporal dimensions really characterize our individual differences from one another. And this graph, which is somewhat complicated, represents how negative you are at the past, how positive you are about the past, how fatalistic you are about the present, how hedonistic you are about the present, and how future-oriented you are. This red dotted line is Zimbardo's idea of the good life. Nothing more significant than that. It's just, you probably wouldn't be that bitter about your past. You'd be relatively positive about your past. You wouldn't think that you were sort of trapped in the present and that nothing you did mattered. You would in fact think that you should have a good time here in the present, but perhaps in equal measure think that you need to get your work done for tomorrow as well, and that's the good life. So we just wanted to see whether somebody who has been living with their mom for the last 30 years and who no longer can imagine what tomorrow will bring, how does that affect their attitudes about the future? And you might think that it would make them really fatalistic on the one hand. My life isn't going anywhere, and it's not going to anytime soon. Or on the other hand, you might think that since they can't imagine the future, all holds that impulsive wild, crazy behavior was the right thing because they can't think about the consequences of their actions. What's really shocking is that in hedonism and fatalism, they're all beneath, this is the 50th percentile on each of those measures. Every one of the amnesics that we've tested comes in at floor, near floor, on KC, this is KC right here, at floor on hedonism. Right? And way, way below the 50th percentile in being fatalistic about the present. And then if you look at, I mentioned earlier that you could ask somebody, how much will you pay me today for $100 in a month, $100 in a year, $100 in 2 years? And Pascal Boyer, who I'm really glad I'm not following in this series, he's going to speak to you in a couple of weeks, had published a paper in which he claimed that individuals without episodic mental time travel would precipitously discount the future. That $100 in 2 years means nothing to them because they can't imagine 2 years in the future. They don't have any sense of the importance of the future. So having lost this, you would expect the value of $1 to plummet if this is the psychological mechanism. And that was his prediction. So we did the study. He was involved in the study. And we found out that they discount, this is KC and DA, they're in the same age bracket. This is HC, who's in an age bracket of her own, and DG, who's also in an age bracket of his own. And their controls for, at the top, $100 and $2,000 delayed over 500 weeks. And then we just asked them at these different delays, how much would you pay us for that amount of money today? It's a more complicated experiment than that, but that's roughly what's going on. And we find that their rate, we're all over the map on this. I might be very different from you guys, and we're all going to be slightly different. This is a source of individual variability in us. But what's really shocking is how these lines are right on top of one another. That inability to imagine the future in this episodic sense doesn't influence how much you value the future. So he knows there's a future, he knows it's coming, he can invest it with value, and he says he cares about it. Trapped in the present? Permanent present tense? Seems like an overly strong characterization of what's going on, or that we need something more subtle to capture the nuances of what's going on in these guys. It also turns out you give them probabilities to work with, and they're fine. They do, how much would you pay for a 10% chance of $100? They do it just like the rest of us, hitting pretty much normative values. But now, that's just asking him, how much would you give me for $100 today? We wanted to put him in a situation where he was, where we could test his tendency towards impulsive behavior. So is it the case that if I put a consent form in front of him, he'll just sign it, but he's signing it because of his impulsive nature, rather than because he thought it through and decided that that was the right thing to do. So we gave him a test that's designed to distinguish two things. On the one hand, there's impulsivity, and on the other hand, there's risk-taking. You might think that these would show up in the same way, that if you're a risk-taker, you're going to act impulsively, and if you're an impulsive person, you're going to act like a risk-taker. So we devised a test that would separate these two things. The test involves presenting 5 cards incrementally on a computer screen, either in an ascending order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or in a descending order, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. They're allowed to tap the screen, and when they tap the screen, the dealing stops. The cards are then revealed, and if the winning card is under, they win a reward, and the reward is inversely proportional to the number of cards on the screen. So there's an incentive, if you're a big risk taker, to choose when there are very few cards on the screen, not when there are lots of cards on the screen. But if you're an impulsive person, that you can't wait, you can't delay acting, then when you're given the descending presentation, you should act with many cards on the screen. And in the ascending condition, you should act with very few cards on the screen. So impulsivity is going to look like this, where this is the subtract condition and this is the add condition. And risk-taking is going to look like somebody who chooses with very few cards on the screen in the first place. Kent came out in neither of these categories, and the same is true for the others. So now we find that there's no reason to think he's impulsive, no reason to think he discounts the future differently than the rest of us, and no reason to think that he understands his place in time or values his place in time any differently from the rest of us. All right. This is a study to show that he could also imagine regretting things in the future and to show that he, in fact, can regret things. And this is about moral decision making. But I want to mention one last thing here before I end. So all of that's supposed to, those studies, and there are more that I haven't gone through, are really just designed to assess how he can make decisions and whether he's considering the right stuff in his decisions and valuing it. The first set of things were just, does he understand the experimental setup and the consent situation at all? But then there's this question about whether he's doing the things that he does voluntarily, and that's where I want to end at the end. Is it possible that they, for instance, can know that they have the right to withdraw? He's already said that he knows that, but can he figure out that he wants to? And to me, that's the remaining puzzle. And the evidence goes sort of both ways. So I'm just going to end honestly on this one. On the one hand, we all learn information about the world via mechanisms that are, I want to say beneath, but distinct from this episodic mechanism that we're talking about. Learning a golf swing, becoming addicted to cigarettes, learning to play a song on the piano. Those are the kinds of things that can continue even in the absence of the ability to remember these specific experiences from one's past. And also emotional stuff. So in a classic test that I've never done on Kent and I've never seen done on Kent, and I'm not sure people even do it anymore, people would meet an individual, say, in an emergency room, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. The person would put out their hand to shake their hand. You hide a pin in your hand. And then you jab them. And then you put the pin away and you go to shake their hand again. You see whether they pull back. This is known as the Clapper-Ed test. And it turns out that individuals with this form of amnesia will start pulling their hand back after a while. But interestingly, if you ask them why, they don't say, because you just stuck me. They say something like, because sometimes doctors hide pins in their hands. They give a very generic and semantic characterization of what's going on in this one. Antonio Damasio did a set of studies on a guy with amnesia where he was living in a home, and he divided the people who worked in the home into two groups, the good guys and the bad guys. And he had the good guys be really nice to him, and the bad guys treated him poorly. And then after a while, he showed them pictures of people, none of whom he recognized, and said, who would you like to hang out with? And almost to a T, almost perfectly, he sorted them into the two groups, the good guys and the bad guys. So something's getting processed here. Even if he's unable to justify any of those decisions, his preferences are being updated. So one might think if he's in an experiment and things are going in a way that he doesn't like, he might still be able to accumulate the thought, I don't want to be here any longer, this is unpleasant. On the other hand, there are mixed results in what's known as the Iowa gambling task. The Iowa gambling task involves giving people 4 piles of cards that have different, they also have a reward structure. Some are wins and some are losses in this one. And you have to choose from one pile at a time and then decide how you're going to select cards to maximize your payout. And the rest of us will learn pretty quickly that 2 of these things give us big rewards quickly and then bleed us. The other ones, on the other hand, will give us some small losses and some small gains, but in the end will produce much larger rewards than the other. And then the question is, can you get naive subjects, and how long does it take them to realize that these are the decks that I should pull from, and those are the ones that I shouldn't? There was one study where they found that, this is the Turnbull and Evans with an N of 1. That's the science we're dealing with here. Well, it's just the way it goes. N of 1, where they did do the change. There's one over here with an N of, I think, 12, where we see some of them don't make the change. In KC, when we did it, didn't make the change. Now, getting stabbed in the hand is much more salient, much more immediate than this kind of thing. And I suspect that KC is capable of learning under those circumstances. But in these, when it's rather indirect, things do start to get a bit murky. And one might wonder whether he's really updating the structure of the world in the way that we would expect or want. I'm going to close roughly here and just try to say what I was trying to do here, what I'm trying to get across. For me, this whole issue has really three dimensions. There's just an immediate one about one guy, Kent, who's now dead. So in a way, it's not as pressing as it once was. But could he have had the cognitive capacities to, should we have let him just consent for himself? And I'm increasingly of the opinion that in these contexts where the stakes are relatively low, we now know enough to say, shouldn't be much of a problem with it. You would think there was a problem if you were to engage in semantic creep and spread the notion of episodic memory out from its relatively circumscribed locations. There's also a question about how we should treat individuals like this when we meet them in the clinic or as part of our experiments. And there, I think, part of what we've learned today is that there's this practice of dual consent, which we do to make ourselves feel comfortable about how we're treating these people. But I would like to promote people I would like to prompt reflection on whether that's really an advance over the proxy consent model, whether it just involves proxy consent plus deception. And if that's the case, then I think that's not a good practice for us to be engaged in. But finally, I really think that we're trying to make some inroads on this philosophical puzzle. What does this kind of memory contribute to our lives as persons? And most of what I've told you today is, well, it's not by giving us semantic knowledge, and it's not by being the glue of personal identity, and it's not by allowing us to make decisions about the future. Maybe in the question and answer, we can start getting to where my positive answer is going. But just to give you a hint, so I don't leave you completely empty, the idea that I'm playing with it at the moment is that it's really about executing actions and not about thinking through which actions you should do. You probably are like me in having an experience periodically where you go to your office to get something, but then you stand in the doorway wondering why you're there. What was it that you came to get? What was I doing? What am I doing right now? And it's an embarrassing and uncomfortable situation. And I think individuals with amnesia spend much of their life in exactly that situation. If you ask them questions, they'll give you reasonable answers. They're not dumb. They haven't been made uninformed. They haven't been made ignorant. They haven't been made incapable of thinking. They're perfectly capable of all of those things. What they seem to lack is an ability to implement all of that in extended actions. And so in this way, their lives can be really cut very short by this disorder, but not in a way that renders them subhuman, in a way that makes them face hurdles that are not unlike somebody who's lost the use of their legs. And perhaps there are ways that we can build a world around them that would make use of these residual capacities that we're trying to demonstrate and scaffold a life that would otherwise be taken to be over. And that's really what matters to me most in this research area, is that we have a tendency to overblow the significance of our favorite cognitive capacities. And this is an important one. And it's really central to our everyday thinking about why people are important to us, and very central to what matters to us in our lives. But I think there's room for both scientific and philosophical reflection on what this capacity is and what it really does contribute to our lives as persons that can't be contributed by other capacities. And that's it. Thank you very much. All right. You want me to take them myself? Yeah, please. Yeah.
He did come up with, well, it's not this, and it's not this, and it's not this, and was able to paint images from some kind of human part that suggested there was something there, and that is what made him human.
Well, I don't yet have a clear story of, I think what, that it seems like there are other things that are present in Kent besides the episodic memory that are responsible for us thinking of him as human going forward. This is going to sound like hair splitting. I think what makes him human is that he's a product of human parents. And that's it. So I use the word human for a biological category. And to be a member of the humans is to be born of humans. So maybe a Darwinian way of thinking about species or something, a lineage. I'm interested in personhood, which is a subclass of the humans, not the comatose ones and et cetera, and the ones that are capable of doing. And then I take your point to be that it looks like a lot of what's grounding our sense that he continues to be that sort of special thing is what's retained in these other cognitive capacities. And I think that's exactly what I'm pushing, is that, that the way that cognitive science carves up the mind does not correspond to the way that we talk about one another's minds when we're engaged in our day-to-day lives with one another. And what's important to us about people need not map in any direct way onto the ontology that a mature cognitive science will decide on. And so part of what I'm trying to say, and for this audience, I thought about putting a big section in here on friendship and love. And Roddy Roediger told me I should never talk about this in public, but I'm going to. My wife and I have an ongoing discussion of how much of our marriage is in explicit memories of things that we've done together. I'm very fortunate. I have a wonderful marriage, and I'm just so lucky, I think, to have that. And how much of that is that we've done all of this stuff together, and now we sit around and we remember it in vivid detail. And how much of it is it that when we're cooking together in the kitchen, we move effortlessly around the space. I know what makes her laugh. I know what buttons not to push at which times. And that much of our relationship seems to be at that level. And I'm not saying that there isn't this other stuff as well, but so much of what bonds us together is in what we know, not what we remember, how we act with one another, how we instinctively move together. And I think that the central point here is that a lot of what we care about in humans is there. So it's going to be a consequence of my view on friendship that you could meet somebody in an airport in Heathrow, sitting there watching a soccer game, and have a friendship. It doesn't have a history, and needn't. That much of what happens can happen in the here and now, in a trade between people who just click. And I think a lot of our relationships, some of them click and some of them don't, and that a lot of what underlies what's important to us about others is in these other systems, as you're rightly pointing out. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Many scientists regard the DNA molecule as kind of a nanocomputer with storage capability, the ability to interact with the environment. Okay, now this may be primitive level, but DNA, your memory could be destroyed, but DNA is distributed throughout your entire body. Now, is it possible that it could reconstitute a memory? That's one question. And the other one is, have you forgotten your Ford wedding ring?
We gave up. we just gave up at some point. It was hopeless. Thank you. The question that you ask is, in fact, really fascinating, and I think we're at a moment right now. I don't want to overhype this. There was a time in the 1960s where people were doing work on learning in planaria, so very simple systems. Eric Kandel won a Nobel Prize several years ago for working on aplesia. And the thought was, if we can study learning in these very, very simplistic organisms, then maybe we can bootstrap our way up from those organisms to understanding cognition in humans. And there was a research program in the 1960s that had its own journals and multiple labs, and it was well funded out of the University of Michigan, so not exactly a scrub institution, though I'm a Buckeye. So it's got problems up there, but not in the neurosciences. And that was all. They would take worms and they would train them to go on a T-maze, so they would go down and turn either left or right, and you'd train them to turn in one direction. And then they would take the ones that had been trained and they would put them in a Waring blender and grind them up. And then feed them to the next generation. Sorry, I should be more. fed them to the next group of worms, and then saw whether without training they just went the right direction. And the report was that they did. And then the thought was that memory must be stored in some chemical form. Because the way that we think about it now, it's in the electrical connections between neurons. And once the brain dies or gets chopped up, that all disappears. It can't last through all of that. But these guys were finding that, and they didn't think it was DNA, they thought it was RNA, some sort of RNA molecule. That idea was published, the earliest paper on what we now take to be the main mechanisms here, the electrical ones, the long-term potentiation, that first paper appears in 1973 in a conference proceeding where the keynote speaker is Holger Hedane, the guy who pushes this idea. So they were the outliers in the 1960s. Now electrical stories and synaptic stories are really at the forefront. But people are getting bored with that, or starting to find problems with that way of thinking about memory. And suddenly you're starting to see people migrate back in a molecular direction. So I think your idea, which sounds a little outlandish at first, is nonetheless a possibility, remains an open possibility.
Incorporated in artificial intelligence, okay, based on that same model, right? Nano model of DNA as computers and storage and learning capability from the environment.
Yeah.
I think they picked up some of those ideas, you know.
Yeah, well, that's possible. And there were people who had, very early on in this, they said, look, we have, what is the piece of what is the only thing that we know in nature? What is the most impressive information storage device that we know in nature? DNA. So why not use that? All right, to you back here.
I would be curious to know if any studies have been done by people who have memory loss due to suppression or, say, early childhood violence of some kind, and so they totally lost everything. And would that be a consent if a person was in a study? Would chain of custody come into effect, like in prisoners that have a chain of custody through the system?
Sorry, I'm taking that deep sigh because you're opening a huge can of worms. No, and I don't know what to do about the consent issue. But what I will report to you is that there's a huge body of research on implanted memories. One thing that I didn't say today, but I usually do as part of this, we should all remember, when we're talking about these guys with the memory deficits, we should remember that all of us have bad memories in some objective sense, that we do confabulate the past. And there are, Elizabeth Loftus in the 1980s and the 1990s has done a series of gorgeous studies showing that you can implant artificial memories in people very easily. And the stuff that you're talking about, traumatic early childhood memory loss issues, is also its own clinical world. So there's both the traumatic memory loss world and which I just honestly haven't thought much about in this context, or how that would impact on these consent issues. And I just don't want to speak off the cuff about it. Is that okay? Yeah, but there is a research area on childhood memories and recovered memories. And as you're probably aware, it's an incredibly contentious area. There was a period in the 1980s where people were being arrested for ritual satanic child abuse. And there were a group of people who were experts that went around interviewing children about their having been abused by these satanic figures in robes. And it turns out that an awful lot of cases ended up, well, people went to jail. In one case, a sheriff went to jail admitting to having participated in satanic ritual abuse, when later it was proved that he was not even in town at the time that he had admitted to engaging in this activity. And so memory is very complicated around trauma, and it's very frail. And I think that's a backdrop to all of this that is worth emphasizing. So I didn't really address your question, but I talked around it. Yeah. And then,
Could you comment on the term when we talk about memory and the Eastern spiritual contemplative thought and present-day mindfulness?
Absolutely. I mean, that helps to make my case maybe even better. You know, we act as if being trapped in the now is horrific, you know, but perhaps perhaps there are advantages. You know, one could speak of this as uniformly a loss, but in some ways it might be a gain. Not having to worry about what you need to do, not being plagued with guilt about things from one's past. That the consequences, my friend Joel Anderson, who was with me when I first started getting involved in this stuff, pointed out that, you know, if somebody tells you that your mother never loved you, I knew your mom, and it's just sad. She used to tell me how much she didn't like you, and it must have been hard, you know, and you would carry that with you for the rest of your life, that it would be just so devastating. But it's possible that if you're the kind of person that just, that information goes in one ear and out the other, and it doesn't stick, that you're in some ways free. Another thing that his mom has said to me that I'd like to flip around, I used to talk with her when they were doing other experiments, and she said that the most irritating thing about Kent is that he's so unmotivated, that he would just sit there and play solitaire all day if left to his own devices. Now, my 14-year-old daughter is similar, I think. But I think there's something about boredom there. That maybe boredom requires tracking that I've been doing something monotonous for too long now. And I wonder whether a person, we haven't done any studies on boredom yet, but I wonder whether that might be another way that one in the here and now is free of something. That a person in the here and now needn't find things tedious. And so I think it's interesting that if we come at this from a different cultural tradition, we might say, oh, these guys have really reached the apex. You know? Like, and in fact, that idea is floated. Like Sue Corkin herself mentions that a couple of times in her biography of HM. So, yeah.
What do you see as the difference between being trapped in the here and now and being trapped in the here and now and needing to live with your mother?
No, good. That's a perfectly good question. I just think that for a typical healthy person, staying at home and living with your folks for a long period of time is an indication that you're not yet thriving and not independent. And that somebody who's been living under those circumstances, it is just true that individuals with these kinds of deficits are at home, that their parents do start treating them as afflicted individuals. That part of what we deal with in somebody who's been living under those situations for 30 years is that they're living in a world of caretakers who have started to treat them as a certain kind of object in this world. And they fall into a mode of behavior that fits that situation. I guess part of what I'm suggesting is that what you see in a person who's been living with their folks with a cognitive deficit 30 years is not what the cognitive deficit left them like. It's what the cognitive deficit plus the change in those social circumstances has left us with. And that those can be something in addition to the cognitive deficit on its own.
That's true for somebody who moves out at 18, at 8:30, they may be somebody that they're not as a result. That's inevitable.
Yeah.
Our social environment conditions who we are. We just put a negative judgment. I have to say, I completely disagree with that statement. That makes that's a cultural bias.
That living at home is...
It leads us to make statements like, how can we build a world around them that's somehow meaningful? You know, why don't we look at it, for instance, to say, what do these people have to teach us? That was something that you got towards in your earlier statement where you said that the people can be free. And we're all conditioned to be focused on whatever it is we're focused on that no longer even bothers these people. Had we somebody live with us, I could come home and say, oh my God, I'm home. You know, I can be with that person. And that reminds me of that the stuff that goes on out there that chews me up, that makes me see a psychologist or whatever, really doesn't amount to that much.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we're that far apart from one another. Part of what I'm trying to do is to say that although these people have had this thing happen to them, there's an awful lot left of their life besides, if I left you with the impression that I thought that these guys were, that I meant to be leaving them in worse shape at the end of this talk than they were at the beginning of this talk, quite the opposite. What I'm trying to do is to emphasize how much of them is left and how much we can reach, but your point is taken. We come to these situations with a valenced, with ideas about what a good life is. And I'll take it as a helpful corrective that, speaking off the cuff, I said something about living at home being somehow less pleasant than living on your own, and thereby displayed the virtues of somebody who thinks that independence is a real virtue of living, something like that. And I don't mean to come down hard on that in any way. I really would love for this talk to in fact leave you with the sense that there's an awful lot going on in the cognitive lives of these people that allow them to have a perfectly rewarding and fulfilling life. And it's not so much about the rewarding and fulfillingness, it's about whether they're the kind of thing that deserves the special status that we attribute to individuals that we call persons, decision makers, competent agents. And to me, what I'm trying to do is to salvage that out of these guys. Now, it might be that their lives have been transformed in ways that make it better in some ways, or that we should just be neutral in our characterization of that. That's fine. But we got to make decisions about things like how to get consent out of them. And I'm lobbying for them, not against them.
So with that thought, I think we should let, this is on, Professor Craver have the last word. Before we thank him for this wonderful talk, I want to note that you mentioned a couple of times that your question opened cans of worms. And expecting that to happen, we've provided a buffet. There will be 2 bowls. The chopped worms in one have been trained, and in the other not. And your job is to pick the right bowl, and and then come back next week for a test when we have a talk by Lisa Pawlowski on art and memory. In any case, please join me in thanking Carl Craver for a wonderful talk.